They said she was cursed. The words followed Eleanor Vance like a stray dog, starved and snapping at her heels. In Blackwood Gulch, a name was a brand, and hers was scorched with misfortune. 2 husbands, both buried before their time. The first, a good man named Thomas, taken by a fever that swept through the valley like a phantom thief. The second, young Mr. Abernathy, thrown from a horse not 2 months after their vows were spoken. Misfortune, the preacher had called it, a trial from the Lord. A curse, whispered the town. The whispers grew louder than the church bells. They said she was a black widow, that she drew the life from men to sustain her own quiet, plain existence. The Abernathy family, raw with grief and sharp with blame, cast her out with the clothes on her back and not a penny more. They stood on the porch of the home she had briefly kept, their faces masks of righteous sorrow, and pointed her toward the dusty road. So she stood there, a solitary figure in a worn gray dress, the merciless sun beating down on her head. The gazes of the townspeople were stones thrown from a safe distance. No one offered a room. No one offered a kind word. She was an omen, a walking tragedy they wanted no part of. Her options had dwindled to nothing. From the shade of the land office porch, Silas Blackwood watched. His name was the town's name for a reason. His grandfather had carved this settlement from the unforgiving wilderness, and the Blackwood Ranch was still the heart that pumped life into the entire county. Silas was a man forged from the same hard earth. Tall and broad, with a face that looked as if it had been hewn from granite, he moved with a silence that commanded more attention than a shout ever could. He was a widower himself. His wife Sarah had been lost to the cold 3 winters past, leaving him with a sprawling, silent house and 2 sons as wild and untamed as the coyotes that yipped in the hills. Leo, 10, and Finn, 7, were his grief-given form, feral, angry, and unreachable. The housekeepers he hired never lasted more than a month. Silas watched Eleanor Vance. He saw not a curse, but a woman standing alone against the tide of scorn, unbowed. Her chin was high, her back straight. There was a strength in her stillness that the townsfolk, in their noisy judgment, had missed entirely. He had a problem he could not solve. He had land, money, and respect, but his home was a hollow shell, and his sons were slipping through his fingers like dry dust. He saw a solution. Later that day, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, he found her. She had been given temporary, reluctant shelter in a small, damp room behind the church, a place that smelled of old hymnals and charity. She was mending a tear in her shawl when his shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, her eyes the color of a stormy sky, showing no surprise, only a weary readiness for the next blow. Silas did not waste time on pleasantries. His voice was rough, like dry wood. "They say you're cursed, Mrs. Vance." Eleanor's hand stilled in her lap. "They say many things. They say any man who weds you finds an early grave." He stepped into the room, his presence shrinking the already small space. He did not smile, but a strange light entered his eyes. Good. Her brow furrowed. Of all the reactions she had braced herself for, this was not one. "I have a ranch," he stated, his words laid out like fence posts, plain and sturdy, "and 2 sons who need a mother. I need a woman to run my house. You need a home, a place to be." She stared at him, trying to find the trick in his words. There was always a trick. You saw the question in her eyes and answered it before she could ask. The curse is the reason. No decent man in this county will come sniffing around my wife, trying to turn her head with pretty words. No ranch hand will get ideas above his station. The gossip that drives them away from you will keep them away from me. You'll be safe from them, and my home will be safe from the trouble a pretty face can bring. It was the most brutally practical proposal ever uttered. It was not a courtship. It was a contract, a business arrangement between two desperate parties. She was to be a scarecrow, her reputation the thing that kept the crows away. The thought should have stung, but the honesty of it was a strange relief after weeks of whispers and lies. Tears pricked her eyes, tears of sheer, exhausted disbelief. He wanted her because she was an outcast. He saw her ruin as a virtue. "I accept," she heard herself say, the words thin but clear. Then she found a piece of her pride, a shard of the woman she was before the whispers began. She met his gaze directly. "But I will have your respect, Mr. Blackwood. I will be a mother to your boys and a partner in your home, not a servant. I am not a piece of property you are acquiring." For the first time, the corner of Silas's mouth tilted. Not quite a smile, but a crack in the stone. I would expect nothing less. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was made in a silence as vast as the prairie stretching out around them. The ranch itself was impressive, a testament to decades of hard work. A large, sturdy house stood sentinel over a collection of barns and corrals, all of it nestled in a valley that seemed to cradle the last light of the day. But as they drew closer, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The house, for all its size, seemed empty. The windows were like vacant eyes. This was a place of profound, unresolved grief. The front door opened before Silas could reach for it. Two boys stood there, their faces smudged with dirt and defiance. They looked at Eleanor with open hostility. "This is Eleanor," Silas said, his voice flat. "She'll be living here now." The older boy, Leo, spat on the ground near her feet. The younger one, Finn, clutched a wooden bird with a broken wing and glared, his little face a thundercloud. They did not say a word. They simply turned and vanished back into the shadows of the house. Welcome home. The first days were a silent war. The house was a fortress of grief, and Sarah Blackwood's ghost was its queen. Her portrait hung over the mantel, her porcelain dolls sat pristine on a high shelf, and her scent, a faint trace of lavender, seemed to cling to the curtains. Eleanor did not try to erase her. She simply tried to make a small space for herself. The boys were relentless. They put a snake in her sewing basket. They accidentally spilled a bucket of muddy water on the floor she had just scrubbed. They spoke to her only in monosyllables, if they spoke at all, often referring to her as her or the woman. Silas observed it all from a distance. He did not intervene. It was her battle to fight. He watched her from the door of his study, or through the kitchen window as he returned from the fields. He saw her patience, a deep, quiet well that seemed to have no bottom. She never raised her voice. She never struck them. She simply cleaned up the mud, removed the snake, and continued her work with a steady, unshakable calm. The first crack in their defenses came a week after her arrival. Finn, the younger boy, was carrying a stack of plates to the table. His eyes were on Eleanor, full of childish malice. He let one slip. It shattered on the stone floor. It was not just any plate. It was a beautiful, hand-painted piece from a set Eleanor had noticed was kept separate from the everyday dishes. Finn's face went pale. He had expected anger, a sharp reprimand that would justify his hatred. He looked ready for a fight. Eleanor knelt, her movements slow and deliberate. She began to pick up the larger shards, her expression one of sorrow, not anger. "That was your mother's, wasn't it?" she asked softly. Finn nodded, his lower lip trembling. "It's all right to be angry," she said, not looking at him, her focus on the broken porcelain. "It's all right to miss her, but breaking her things won't bring her back." She found the largest piece, a painted bluebird now split in two. "We should find a box. We can keep the pieces safe, so you'll always have a part of it to remember her by." From the doorway of his study, Silas watched. He had been ready to step in, to deliver the punishment the boy deserved for such a deliberate act of destruction. But he stopped. He saw the empathy in her actions, the wisdom in her words. She wasn't trying to replace Sarah. She was helping his son preserve her memory. He felt something shift inside him, a small, unfamiliar flicker of respect. She was not the fragile, broken thing the town saw. She was made of something far stronger. That night he found a small, carved wooden box in an old trunk and left it on the kitchen table. He said nothing about it. The next morning, it was gone. Later, he saw Finn carrying it out to the barn, the broken pieces of the plate nestled safely inside. A quiet truce began to form, built not on words, but on small, unspoken acts. Eleanor found the boys' winter coats, torn and neglected, and mended them with neat, strong stitches. She discovered an old music box that had belonged to Sarah, its tune tinny and broken. She spent an entire evening patiently working on the delicate mechanism until it played its lullaby once more. When Finn woke from a nightmare, screaming for his mother, it was Eleanor who went to him. She sat by his bed and hummed the melody from the music box until his sobs quieted and he drifted back to sleep. Silas began to notice the changes. The house was cleaner, warmer. There was the smell of baking bread in the air. His sons were still wary, but the sharp edges of their hostility had begun to soften. He started leaving a mug of warm milk on the table for her before he went out to the barns in the pre-dawn chill. He noticed her struggling with a dull axe and, without a word, took it to his workshop, returning it the next day with a razor-sharp edge. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the necessities of the day, but a silent language was developing between them. A shared glance across the dinner table. A nod of acknowledgement. It was a partnership taking root in the barren soil of their arrangement. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in, the kind that shook the very foundations of the house. Thunder cracked like a whip, and rain lashed against the windows. Eleanor was securing a rattling shutter when she heard a small sound from the living room. She found Silas standing before the portrait of his late wife, his expression lost in a private sorrow so deep it seemed to suck the air from the room. She started to back away, not wanting to intrude. "She loved the rain," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the portrait more than at her. It was the first time he had mentioned Sarah by name. Eleanor stood in the doorway, a silent witness. She did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply stood there, sharing the space and the weight of his grief for a moment. "It's a good sound," she said finally. "The sound of the world being washed clean." He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of gratitude. He was not a man who shared his burdens, but in that small moment he had let her see a piece of his pain. It was a fragile bridge built between two isolated souls in the middle of a storm. Leo remained the final holdout. At 10, he was old enough to remember his mother clearly, and he guarded her memory with a fierce, jealous loyalty. He saw every kind act from Eleanor as a betrayal, every step she took toward making the house a home as an attempt to erase his mother. The first blizzard of the season hit without warning. A white wall descended upon the ranch, burying the world in a sea of snow and wind. Silas was out checking on the herd, and Eleanor was in the house with the boys. When Silas finally fought his way back to the barn, exhausted and half frozen, he called for Leo to help him with the horses. There was no answer. A frantic search of the house revealed the boy was gone. A set of small tracks leading from the back door was already disappearing under the rapidly drifting snow. A cold dread, colder than the wind, seized Silas. Leo had run away, into the heart of a blizzard. "Stay inside," Silas ordered Eleanor, his voice raw with panic as he pulled on a heavier coat. "Keep the fire going. I'll find him." But Eleanor had seen the look in Leo's eyes that morning, a desperate, desolate anger. She knew the boy was not thinking straight. She pulled on her own worn coat and a thick scarf. "You know the ranch," she said, her voice firm, "but I know what it is to feel lost. I'm coming with you." For a moment he looked ready to argue, but the determination in her face was absolute. He gave a sharp nod, and they stepped out into the howling chaos. They split up, shouting Leo's name into the wind, the sound swallowed by the storm. Eleanor fought against the blinding snow, her mind racing. Where would a hurt, angry boy go? Not to the open fields. He would seek shelter. An old line shack, Silas had mentioned once, on the north ridge. It was barely standing, but it was cover. It was a foolish guess, a prayer against the storm, but she turned toward the ridge. The wind tore at her, and the cold bit deep into her bones. But she pushed on, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain. It was the fierce, protective urge of a mother, an emotion she thought had been buried with her first husband. She found him. He was huddled in a corner of the dilapidated shack, shivering violently, his face pale and his lips blue. He was trying to be brave, but when he saw her, his facade crumbled, and he started to cry. Silent, racking sobs. She wrapped him in her own coat, ignoring the cold that immediately seeped into her bones. "It's all right," she whispered, holding him close. "I've got you. We're going home." The journey back was a nightmare. She had to support Leo, half carrying him as the storm raged. She fell multiple times, the world a dizzying vortex of white. By the time they stumbled into the main barn, where Silas was frantically preparing a second search party, she was on the verge of collapse. Silas saw them in his face, a mask of terror, flooded with relief. He swept Leo into his arms and carried him toward the house, then turned back for Eleanor. He saw her sway on her feet, her face ashen with exhaustion. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. He laid her on the sofa by the fire and wrapped her in thick blankets. Leo was already bundled up, sipping hot broth that Finn had brought him. The two boys watched, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. They had seen this quiet, plain woman walk into the teeth of a blizzard for one of them. Leo looked at her from across the room, his gaze no longer hostile. In its place was a dawning, grudging respect. She had not only saved him, she had come for him when no one else could. The fragile peace of the Blackwood Ranch was shattered by the arrival of a carriage. Beatrice Sterling, Sarah's younger sister, swept into the house like a storm of a different kind. Dressed in fine silks from the city, she surveyed the comfortable domesticity of the home with a look of pure disdain, her eyes landing on Eleanor as if she were a piece of dirt on the floor. "Silas," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I came as soon as I heard. Marrying this person, after what they say about her. I had to come and see to the welfare of my poor nephews." Beatrice was the physical embodiment of the town's judgment, but with a sharper, more personal edge. She had always believed that she, not some cursed outcast, should have been the one to step into her sister's shoes. She saw Eleanor not just as an unsuitable wife, but as a usurper. Her visit was a campaign of psychological warfare. She filled the boys' heads with poisonous whispers about Eleanor, reminding them of their real mother, suggesting that Eleanor was trying to make them forget. She would tell stories of Sarah's beauty and grace in Eleanor's presence, every word a carefully aimed dart. Eleanor bore it with her usual quiet dignity, refusing to be drawn into Beatrice's games. But she saw the confusion it caused in the boys, especially Leo, who was torn between his newfound respect for Eleanor and his loyalty to his mother's family. The conflict came to a head one afternoon in the main barn. Beatrice had cornered Leo, telling him a vicious lie, that Eleanor had thrown away his mother's favorite gardening gloves. It was a small thing, but it was the final straw for the boy's frayed emotions. He confronted Eleanor, his voice shaking with accusation. "You threw them away. You want her gone." "Leo, I would never do that," Eleanor said calmly, trying to de-escalate the situation. From the shadows, Beatrice watched with a triumphant smirk. Her plan was working perfectly. In his rage, Leo kicked over a lit lantern that sat near a pile of dry hay. Flames erupted with terrifying speed, racing up the wooden walls. The smirk vanished from Beatrice's face, replaced by a scream of terror. Finn, who had followed them into the barn, was trapped behind a wall of fire. Beatrice froze. Silas, hearing the screams, was running from the house. But Eleanor did not hesitate. No. She grabbed a heavy horse blanket, soaked it in the water trough, and ran directly into the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke thick and choking. She found Finn, huddled and crying, and wrapped him in the wet blanket, shielding him with her own body. Silas burst through the main doors just in time to see the scene. He saw Beatrice standing uselessly by the entrance. He saw his son, Leo, paralyzed with fear. And he saw Eleanor, her dress singed and her hair starting to smolder, emerging from the flames with his younger son clutched safely in her arms. His respect, his admiration, it all coalesced in that moment into something fierce and undeniable. It was love. A raw, protective love for the woman who was willing to walk through fire for his child. He met her halfway, taking Finn from her arms and pushing them both toward the safety of the open air as the barn roof began to groan, ready to collapse. Later that night, the barn was a smoldering ruin against the starry sky. Inside the quiet house, the smell of ash and salve hung in the air. Silas gently tended to the burns on Eleanor's arms and hands. Her courage had left its mark on her skin. The boys sat on the floor nearby, watching in silence. The fire had burned away the last of their resistance. This woman was not a curse. She was their protector. Silas's touch was different now. It was no longer the practical touch of a rancher or the careful touch of a stranger. It was infinitely gentle, full of an emotion that his stoic face could no longer conceal. He finished wrapping her hands in clean linen, his fingers lingering on hers. "This was supposed to be a simple arrangement," he said, his voice low and thick with feeling. The words seemed pulled from a great depth within him. "A contract. It is not simple anymore." Eleanor looked at him, her gray eyes searching his. She had come here expecting shelter, nothing more. She had not expected to find a place where she belonged. "I did not expect to find a home," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "I cannot imagine this house without you in it, Eleanor," he confessed. "I don't want to." He leaned in, his gaze fixed on hers, and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of profound gratitude and recognition. It was a promise. It was the sealing of a bond that had been forged not with vows and rings, but with patience, courage, and sacrifice. It was the true beginning of their marriage. But Beatrice was not finished. Humiliated and furious, she fled back to town, her defeat curdling into venom. She marshaled her forces, the gossiping women, the sanctimonious church elders, and the still grieving Abernathy family. She spun a tale of negligence and danger, painting Eleanor as an unstable, cursed influence who had nearly gotten the children killed. They petitioned the circuit judge, who was due in town the following week. They demanded the marriage be annulled, and that custody of Leo and Finn be granted to Beatrice, their only fit and proper blood relative. The confrontation was set for the town hall, a public spectacle designed to shame Silas and destroy Eleanor once and for all. When the day came, the hall was packed. It felt as if the entire county had come to watch the final act of Eleanor Vance's tragedy. Beatrice, dressed in mourning black, gave a tearful, compelling performance. The Abernathys spoke of their lost son and Eleanor's unnatural lack of grief. Mrs. Gable, the town's chief gossip, recounted every rumor with relish. The crowd murmured, their faces a sea of condemnation. Eleanor sat beside Silas, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale but her back straight. Then the judge called for Silas Blackwood to speak. Silas rose to his feet. A hush fell over the room. The silent, stoic rancher was a figure of immense authority, and no one had ever heard him speak more than a few clipped sentences at a time. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the faces in the crowd, his gaze moving from one to the next. Then he turned and looked at Eleanor. "You call this woman cursed," he began, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the silent hall. "You whisper about her in the street and condemn her in your hearts. You see misfortune, and you call it a stain on her character." He took a step toward the center of the room. "Let me tell you what I see. I see a woman who was given 2 sons, full of rage and grief, and she met that rage not with anger, but with a patience as deep as this valley. I see a woman who walked into a blizzard to save a boy who hated her, and she carried him home on her back." His voice grew louder, filled with a passion no one knew he possessed. "I see a woman who ran into a burning barn to save my child, while others stood by and screamed. She has the marks on her arms to prove it. You call her cursed? I call her a blessing." He turned his gaze on Beatrice, his eyes like chips of ice. "You talk of blood and family. This woman has shown more love and loyalty to my sons in a few short months than you have shown in your entire life. She did not try to erase their mother. She helped them honor her. She brought life back into a house that was a tomb." Finally, He looked back at the stunned faces of the townspeople. "You cast her out. You threw her away. And in doing so, you gave me the greatest gift of my life. She is my wife. She is the mother of my sons. Her name is Eleanor Blackwood. And anyone in this room or in this county who speaks another word against her will answer directly to me." A profound silence filled the hall. Then, from the back, a single person began to clap. Then another. The judge, a wise old man who had seen much of human nature, looked at the fierce conviction on Silas's face and the undisguised adoration in the eyes of his two sons, who had stood up to stand beside their father. He banged his gavel once. "Petition denied," he declared. "Case dismissed." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of gold and rose. As they reached the crest of the hill that overlooked their valley, Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. He turned to Eleanor. The fire of the public declaration was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, steady warmth. He took her bandaged hand in his. "This started as a contract, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft. "A practical arrangement. But it's not that anymore. I want it to be a marriage. In truth, in all the ways that matter." He had no ring. Instead, he took a thin strip of leather from his saddle ties. With gentle, calloused fingers, he tied it around her ring finger. It was a simple, rustic band, but it held more meaning than any jewel. "Will you be my wife, Eleanor Blackwood? Truly?" Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in a long, long time, they were tears of pure joy. "Yes, Silas," she whispered. "Yes." A year later, the ranch was thriving. The barn had been rebuilt, stronger than before. The house was no longer a silent, grieving place. It was filled with warmth and the sound of the boys' laughter. Eleanor stood on the front porch, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. A simple gold band now sat on her finger, just above the worn leather tie, which she had refused to ever take off. Leo and Finn were down by the corral, racing sticks in a water trough, their earlier wildness tamed into joyful energy. Silas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He placed his large, warm hand over hers on their unborn child. They stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, bathing their valley in a soft, peaceful light. No words were needed. The curse had been a lie, a story told by fearful people. The truth was here, in the solid feel of the man behind her, in the flutter of life within her, and in the quiet contentment of a family that had been forged in adversity and tempered by love. It was not a home she had been given. It was one she had built.